We are live, and hello, everybody. Tonight I'm joined by it's Doctor, correct?
Correct?
Doctor
Yep.
Dina Dye, or is it Dinah? I
It's
always
Dina.
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 So Doctor
That's the
Dina Dye,
Hebrew pronunciation.
and so Dina has written a series of books, and this is sort of the fourth. It was going to be a three-part series, but then you felt led to write a fourth, or was it always going to be a four-part kind of series?
No, I started out with the whole idea of the temple series, right? And I went through creation, the garden, and Noah's Ark. And at first, when I was thinking about writing that series, I was just going to keep on going. So after Noah's Ark, I was going to do the tents of the patriarchs, the period of the kings, first century, and show the temple through each of these periods. But then after I finished Noah's Ark, I thought, honestly, everything else just fits into these first three books. Like if you understand the pattern of the first three books, the temple in creation, the temple in the garden, the temple in Noah's Ark, you got the whole rest of the story. So I decided to just leave it as a series of three instead of just keep going. And then of course in the midst of all, when I finished Noah's Ark, then COVID hit, and what can I say? I think I was probably like a lot of people where I just couldn't get my mojo working again. I couldn't write, I couldn't think, just I just felt like I was in a hole, and I didn't really write anything for a couple of years. And then I think it was last fall, and I was actually starting to work on writing a book about my own story from, as a child in a Jewish home, and when I finally met Yeshua the Messiah. And I have lots of great stories because I spent many years traveling by myself over in Europe and Africa and the Middle East. And I just had tons of stories I could tell in this book. And it just didn't seem to be the time. And I had really been looking more closely at the Exodus language in the New Testament. And I kept stumbling upon it, especially in the book of Matthew. And I'm going, wait, this is not an accident. These writers were really trying to point us back to the Exodus in many ways, shape, manner, or form. And I then it got to be everything I was looking at in the New Testament, the Gospels and the Epistles. I kept seeing Exodus language. So then I decided, okay, I think I need, I get a sense, I think I need to write something to show people that the New Testament is really dealing with the Exodus story. So long about that time, you're familiar with Bible Project, guys? I'm sure.
Yeah,
Are you?
maybe.
Okay. They're out of Portland. It's kind of spearheaded by a scholar named Tim Mackey, and they've got a bunch of scholars that work for them, and they put out a whole series on Exodus. So I mean, I listened to it. It was a great series. I thought they did a really great job, and then I was really frustrated. I'm like, really, Lord, these guys just said everything I was going to say. I don't even think I could do it any better. I don't even know what my angle is. And that's what okay, if I'm going to write this book, I got to have a perspective that not everybody has, but that is something that, is on the heart of God, but that he wanted to show that thread. So one of the things I brought up in my previous books was this concept of combat myth. And I was just intrigued by it, and I started reading more and more. There's not a lot out there on it, but then I began to realize it was a theme that was, very prevalent in the scriptures. And then I realized, the idea of the combat myth, and I'll give you the rundown in just a second, but that God was seen in the ancient world as this divine warrior who would defeat an enemy and restore things. I thought, well, Yeshua kind of fulfills that role as well. So then I just thought, okay, I think this is going to be my perspective. So I'll give you sort of the 8 areas. This is what I'm looking at. And this was very common in the ancient Near East world, which is why I chose that, because I have been doing a lot of work in that. And so this idea of combat myth was very familiar to the ancients and would have been very familiar to the writers of the scriptures, from the Hebrew scriptures on into the New Testament. They would have known this language and this kind of myth at that time. So here's the sort of layout, that in the ancient world you'd have a divine warrior who would rise up to defeat an enemy called chaos. And we can see in sort of in Genesis chapter 1, this sort of imagery of chaos, the tohu vavohu, etc. That's sort of how that operates. And so these two entities, the divine warrior and chaos, or the chaos figure, or some kind of enemy, would have, there'd be a war between them. And then the victor of that would be the divine warrior. And out of that would come, for defeating chaos, defeating this enemy, this chaos figure, he would receive a temple. And within that, then you had the sort of proclamation of a herald who would come and announce the good news that the divine warrior had defeated the enemy. And then there would be this great procession that would include all the people. And, you just envision them lining the streets of the king, coming and in the litter, right, and being carried. And people, worshiping the king because he had defeated this enemy that had been oppressing them and destroying their lives, et cetera, et cetera. And then they would come to the mountain, the sort of the cosmic mountain I refer to. And at the mountain, the king would ascend and he would be enthroned. And part of that whole process, there would be like a meal, like what we understand as a covenant meal. So that's the basic framework for this. And then I realized it was everywhere. Like it was the whole map in the Hebrew scriptures. And it was the map for the New Testament, the Gospels, and exactly what Yeshua was doing. So that became kind of my premise, and I ran with it.
So if you had to sum up, because I know some people sort of, when I first started reading it, I was going, okay, this is. I was thinking greater Exodus, and I think that's what a lot of people might think.
Mm-hmm.
Greater Exodus at the end of this age, when the house of Judah and the house of Israel gathered from the nations. But
Right.
This is more about the unfolding story of the greatest Exodus, which would be, I don't. You tell me. If you could, take as much time as you want to, but sum up. Sum up that your however many pages it was book.
Well, and to your point, because I know when people hear the title, so the full title is The Greatest Exodus, a Divine Warrior Tradition. But people sort of forget to look at the second half, because that kind of gives you a little bit of clue of where I'm headed. The divine warrior, it's a divine warrior tradition. And so I was trying, and I did this on purpose because I know people sort of debate and get philosophical about, what is the greater Exodus? What does it mean? How will that manifest itself in the end of days? And I just wanted to kind of break through that. And as we were talking before we came online, people don't have any idea what this book is about. Because in their mind, they're going to think the greatest Exodus and sort of the great regathering at the end of days, da, 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 da. And I didn't do that at all. So it was a purposeful attempt by me to kind of, I guess, a little bait and switch there, perhaps. But really, the story it's the gospel story. It's the good news that there is one we call king or divine warrior, defeats our enemy, the greatest enemy of all, being death. And because of that, he receives a temple, which is in essence the whole earth, and that the whole earth, or all of humanity, comes and worships him as he is being enthroned. And in that relationship, that covenant relationship, that the divine warrior provides for us protection and provision, and that all the covenant blessings that go with it. So the greatest Exodus is this deliverance from the greatest enemy, which is death. And of course, Yeshua, the Messiah, perfectly fulfilled that through his death, burial, and his resurrection. So that's really, at the bottom line, is really what the story is about, and really what the book is about. It's just, I am going to show you through the book, as we take these steps from, the chaos figure, the divine warrior, how the battle goes, how divine warrior defeats the enemy, how a herald comes, to announce it, the procession, the proclamation, the enthronement, all of that. I go through the Hebrew scriptures, and I go through the Gospels in particular, not so much into the epistles, etc., but little points there to show you how that pattern is perfectly fulfilled, and why and how Yeshua fulfills it.
Well, like I told you, I read the first 6 or 7 chapters, and I didn't have time to read the whole book. But then I skipped to the last chapter, and one of the themes I saw, it goes back to Genesis 1, and we see it at the
Yep.
end, and we see it in Revelation,
Yep.
is the sea representing chaos, and how the
Correct.
ancient Israel would have viewed the sea. And there's, you have flash floods in the wadis, you have floods on the rivers, you have things of this nature, and water can create chaos. And how in Genesis 1 we see no, God controlling this chaos. And the same
Right.
thing in the flood.
Yeah.
Same thing with the first Exodus out of Egypt, where showing control over the elements in the sea, and the parting of the sea, and the walking through the sea, and then Yeshua commanding the sea to calm down. And then Revelation, the sea is no more. So I mean,
Yes.
that's an example of one of those themes.
It's a perfect example, because that's the one. Out of the beginning, we see the waters, essentially covering the earth, if you will, and that God separates the waters, dry ground from the seas, and dry land appears. We see that in the Genesis story. We see it in the Noah story. We see it in the Exodus story. We see it with Joshua when they're crossing the Jordan River. We see it really in Matthew when Yeshua comes up out of the water from his immersion. I mean, it just is repeated over and over again. And as you say, the ancient Israelites were terrified of water. They were terrified of the seas, because in their minds, this is this dark, brooding place where monsters and chaos lives. And it was a threat. It was a constant threat. And even just in the natural, seas were a threat. I mean, think about living in ancient Mesopotamia, maybe on the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Every year you were worried about, the snow melt and raging waters coming down and flooding your village once again, after you've just planted everything to grow, feed your family, and you keep trying to move back from the river to protect your household, because it keeps flooding. And flooding was a major big deal, for the ancients. Once they learned irrigation techniques, then they could move farther away from the rivers. But this is just an ongoing thing. And so in their world, they use kind of mythological language to describe real things. And so the seas become this sort of chaos threat. And this threat, this figure keeps rising up. So you've got a lot of stories in the Bible that take us right back to the sort of sea stories and water, etc.
And somebody's got a question. And again, it's sort of the premise of your book, the spiritual exodus, the exodus out of Babylon. Like we were talking pre-show, how we are citizens of the kingdom.
Right.
We are subjects to the king, but we live in Babylon just like Daniel did. And so we're in spiritual Egypt, spiritual Babylon, living in what I guess certainly modern day Rome, as opposed to theocracy. So I see a spiritual exodus happening now, triggered by everyone seeing Charlie Kirk kept the Sabbath. Many are coming out of her. And I know JS, what he's talking about is sort of the religion of men, the traditions of
Sure.
men that we talked before this. You were Jewish. I was raised Southern Baptist dispensational theology, but you are seeing this exodus, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
over these past 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years. More and more people are starting to have an exodus away from religion and back to his way and his truth.
Yeah.
And is that part of, do you deal with that at all, or is in your book in between the chapters I didn't read, or?
Yeah, you sort of miss the kind of essence of the New Testament story through the wilderness, and Yeshua going to the Galilee and the seas, and facing down the demoniac, and how that relates to Rome. Like a lot of that sort of language is in those chapters. So you might
Okay.
want to go back and read them. So the way I did the book is essentially I have a prologue in there that just I share my own story as a child celebrating Passover with my family, and our family was all from Eastern Europe. And my grandfather would lead the Seder. He was from Ukraine near the Russian border, and had to escape when he was 12 from Russian Cossacks. and made his way to Canada. So I kind of talk about as a child, because I'm little in the 50s, and that's not very far from Israel being established as a state and the Holocaust. So that's very much on our minds when we are celebrating Passover during that year. And one of my uncles who shared with our Seder was actually a Holocaust survivor. So, the family would talk about that. So I kind of introduced that a little bit. And then in the first chapter, I just sort of bring you this big picture of how important the Exodus story is, that it's the grand drama, really, of all of Scripture, out of which everything else seems to come. And I just introduced concepts about the Exodus, and just how we've sort of lost our way in storytelling, because telling this story we do every year at Passover was so important. And of course, those who are celebrating the way we are repeat and tell the story. But so many, even in the Jewish community, and especially in the secular Jewish community, have completely forgotten the story, don't know the story, don't know even what it means. And so if you don't have that basis to start with, you absolutely will not understand what on earth Yeshua is doing when when the greatest Exodus comes, and he doesn't just defeat Egypt and Pharaoh, but he defeats death, right? The very enemy of enemies. And so the first chapter kind of introduces all that. And then chapters 2 through 6 really take you through the Hebrew scriptures, the story through the eyes of the heralds, the procession through the wilderness to the Mount Sinai, the enthronement at Sinai of Yahweh, the meal, etc. And then when I get to chapter 7, I move into the New Testament, and then I do the same thing all over again to show that same story. We see John the Baptist and come out as the early herald, right, announcing the good news. Yeshua in the waters, in the seas, and then he goes into the wilderness like the children of Israel, and Pharaoh, and then he goes up to the Galilee and the seas there, and does all his miracles, etc. And so I show how he is functioning as a divine warrior. And then the heralds later announce as well, the women who announce that he's been risen from the dead. The tomb is empty. I talk about his enthronement, what that looks like, and then of course the covenant meal, the Passover, and the fulfillment of that. So that's really chapters 7 through 11.
Oh, and then we also see we saw you see the covenant meal in Exodus. I think it's chapter 15, where you have the 70, the elders go have this covenant meal.
Yep.
And then we have the new covenant meal with the disciples, and then we also have at the conclusion of the story, if you will, you have the wedding supper of the Lamb. You have another covenant
meal. Absolutely. So and it's important because I think that is one of the themes that gets missed in the reading of Revelation, because it just pulls it all together. It pulls the entirety of the Exodus story together and kind of, but you have to be able to go back to the story itself to see it. And you did read the last chapter, so kind of what how I was trying to pull that together, and without doing a sort of treatise on the book of Revelation, which is not my intention, but it was to show those elements in Revelation that tie to the divine warrior and the defeat of the chaos beast, as we see beasts coming out of the sea, and the enthronement, Yeshua, on the mountain, the lamb that was slain. And as you just mentioned, the wedding supper, the meal, and then we have no more seas and the new Jerusalem, etc. It's just more of an outline to help people recognize that Revelation is very much a repeat of the Exodus story.
Yep. And you see so many parallels in the especially in the trumpets and the bowls.
Yep.
Back to the plagues that were poured out on Egypt, whereas Israel is being protected for the final 7.
Yeah, I mean, that's a constant theme as well. Despite their rebellion, the Lord, in his covenant relationship with them, is always providing that divine protection, no matter what sort of the geography is of where they are. His hand of protection is always on them. That promise is always there.
Yep, and that's I mean that's very comforting to me.
Amen.
You know, because again, I personally believe we're approaching the end of the age. I'm just not a date setter. But the more and
Best
more,
not to be, because probably you'll be wrong, and then
yeah,
you got to eat your
yeah.
words, right?
Yeah, well, the only thing I'll set a date on is when the resurrection is not happening.
Okay. All right. That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we need to be careful with that stuff. And that's why my intent in the book was to provide a broader picture, to help people see the whole scope of the Bible in a big sense, in the big drama sense. And then after, as you're doing your own research and your own studies, you'll find that all the elements kind of fit into this grand drama that is the Exodus story.
Hey, discuss because again, when I first started reading it, I mean, I was aware of this, but how the ancient Near East and some of the Babylonian mythological stories
Yeah.
compare the similarity there, but the contrast to the biblical narrative, and how the biblical writers, Moses, Joshua, how they draw from what was in the known world at the time, but the clear distinctions between that versus the sure enough, no doubt myth. That's something many people may have never heard.
Yeah. Well, that is a very big topic right there. So we will try to keep it succinct. I think the most important thing is to understand the premise to begin with, because that's the world in which our Bible writers wrote in. So they were very familiar with it. And then if we believe, and I do, that the Bible was probably codified after the Exodus. So, they kept the oral tradition, but they finally sort of put it together in some logical form and codified all of those oral traditions, those oral stories. So you have to believe that a certain amount of the Babylonian experience is going to seep into how they're viewing it now, because this is post, we're like well beyond Genesis, right? So it doesn't kind of matter where you are, you're going to be influenced by the time that you live in. So clearly, the Babylonian world is going to have some kind of influence on them. Now, this will be mostly the Neo-Babylonian period, which we're more in the 600s of BCE, not the first Babylonian, which is much earlier. But the point is, we must understand first what God is doing in the Bible. And so what he is doing, everyone had a creation myth, right? This is not uncommon. So the Bible has its creation story. Babylon, for example, had her own creation myth. But God was always doing something revolutionary, taking the myths of the ancient world and turning them upside down on their heads, because he is putting into the stories this component of creation. Like, that's what drives the narrative from Genesis to Revelation, is how does God restore, recreate? How does he elevate this situation that looks terrible, right? I mean, we see in Genesis, the families are all like pretty well dysfunctional. How is this all going to work out? And so, yeah, God takes these people who are, dysfunctional, and how does he elevate? How does he redeem the story? How does he bring new creation life into every story? So that's going to be the premise, really, of the biblical story. So now you picture Israel in Babylon, living under Babylon's rules, just one more empire. And the best example, I guess, would be their creation story. They had a god named Marduk. He is the head of the pantheon for Babylon. And he is considered, in that world, he would be like a divine warrior. And he goes to battle with this chaos figure called Tiamat. And some scholars will say that the word in Genesis, tehom, is a cognate of Tiamat. I don't really know. That's kind of not my lane, but sounds good to me. So these two are in conflict, and there's this battle that goes on. And then when Marduk takes Tiamat and kind of cuts her in half. And there's a lot of language, like how a divine warrior would defeat the chaos figure, and he would dismember them, and he would trample on them. He would bind them with chains as a measure of control and stopping them. So in this case, he slays Tiamat, slices her in half, and as the creation legend goes, half of her body goes to the upper waters and the other half goes to the lower waters. And he basically takes control over the pantheon of the gods of Babylon, and she is sort of relegated. I mean, and there's lots of, sidebars to these stories. But you look back in Genesis and you kind of see, okay, there's this separation thing going on in Genesis as we separate waters above and waters below, and we can, we separate the seas from the land, and darkness from light and day from night. So there's a separation going on, which was familiar in the ancient world. However, what was God doing that was different? First of all, he didn't have this battle where he took this sword and sliced this, entity in half. He spoke and things separated. And he brought together the world by separating it first and then restoring it or bringing back together. So you see, it's the idea of a Yom Echad, or a one day, we see in the first verses. But what is the conclusion? It's the Sabbath. It's the seventh day, when everything kind of comes together as one, sort of in the realm of like a covenant. So again, we're always looking for the component. How is he bringing creational order out of chaos? How does he does it? How does he do it? What are his methods? What are his tools? How are they different than how the ancient world operated? So, empire, they're going to cut you up, slice you in half, slice and dice you, murderous empire. You're living under oppression. Your life is brutal, terrible, blah, blah. And then we see Yahweh, and he brings a covenant relationship with his people, and he brings blessing and prosperity and unity within the covenant people. And, thou shalt not commit murder and steal, et cetera, as he outlines those sort of covenant requirements. So that's just one example, and there are many, but I hope people can see it through those.
Well, you see the major distinctions between, again, the Roman myths drew from the Greek myths, which drew from the Persian myths, which drew from the Babylonian myths, and you keep tracing back to Syria, Egypt, all the way back to. I like to say all roads don't lead to Rome. When it comes to paganism, they make a pit stop in Rome, but they go all the way back to Babylon, of which Abraham was called out of.
Yeah, the Chaldees. Yeah,
and you trace that story about from Abraham being called out of Chaldees, called out of that, so Yah can make a people from Abraham, and you see that all the way through Revelation, where again he's calling people this greatest exodus, calling you out of this world to his covenant. And you touch, I don't want to say touch on it, but you also discuss about how you've got, you've got the beast, and you've got man made in God's image, and how that is a theme too. In this greatest exodus, how we can remain like those pantheons, the pagan gods. They had very human characteristics. They were murderous, they were adulterous, they were coveting, they were all these things that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not. So you again, I know you touched on that at least in a chapter or two about this, the beast versus man. So you want to extrapolate or expound on that some more?
Well, I mean, you have the sort of external figure of the chaos image, the beast. And that, we go back to the garden. Of course, we see the Hasatan, the adversary, is sort of our first image of a chaos beast, a chaos figure. And then we see it run through, in the Exodus story, of course, Pharaoh is going to rise up and be that chaos figure. And in Babylon, you've got King Nebuchadnezzar serving as that chaos figure. And we have, it's all over the scriptures. It kind of doesn't really matter what story you can usually identify a chaos figure in there, or a beast. And then, of course, the culmination in the book of Revelation of the beast coming out of the sea, which was really a normal image for them. And at that time probably would have been referred to Caesar, and in my estimation, probably a Nero, if we had to guess on the actual Caesar. So these beasts were always tied to empire. who was the ruler of empire going all the way back. And so they would just keep rising up, like you said, through the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. We always had a chaos figure. But we contrast that with, and I bring this up in the book fairly often, is the chaos figure in our own life. Like we are given often to our own beast nature, that place when the unregenerated human heart is sort of turned over to the beast nature, when we indulge ourselves in our own arrogance and addictions and just all the sort of behavioral things that Paul brings up. So there's sort of two layers here. There's that of the external chaos creature that rises up, that's connected to empire and what empire does to people. And then there's the one in our own life, our own chaos creature. And it is the case, Yeshua defeated both, right? And his response in Rome, just I find remarkable, because he is constantly pushing back against Rome in ways I think must have been shocking to people, just to allow himself to be called the Son of God in an environment in which Caesar is the Son of God. I mean, he challenged the sensibilities of the entire religious order. And of course, the result was always going to be he was going to be killed for standing up and speaking out, right? Yeah.
I mean, again, you see that pattern. I believe, it's not just at the very end of this age. We've seen that pattern as people stand up for Yeshua, stand up for truth.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah.
Stephen being the first recorded martyr.
Yeah.
After Yeshua, where he's standing up to the religious system and preaching a scathing sermon.
Yeah. Referring back to the Exodus.
That was exactly. So yeah. Do you cover that as far as make that connection?
I didn't really. The thing is, I didn't want this book to be too long because people don't read it. So I decided to just stay focused on the Gospels and Yeshua's story. But honestly, I mean, I could have written 2 or 3, 4 more chapters with Paul and Acts in particular. There's a lot of Exodus language in the book of Acts. So it ended up on the cutting room floor, if you know what I mean, because I had to figure out where the off button was.
Right.
Who knows? I might have, part 2 where I could actually discuss more sort of the epistles and that I didn't really get to do.
So you've mentioned, as far as the relation back to the initial Exodus, you've mentioned about John the Baptist, the immersion of Yeshua, him calming the seas. What other Exodus motifs, themes, Mount of Transfiguration, maybe? Because again, that's confess,
you missed the whole chapter on the cosmic mountain, which in Matthew, for example, and I'm you got to read it, but I talk about the 7 mountains in Matthew because the other gospels don't address Yeshua going up on a high mountain and things happening, but we have 7 distinct mountains, and so I tied that to the 7 distinct ascensions of Moses onto Mount Sinai. So there's a whole thing in there just covering that. The key, I think, Matthew is probably the easiest to see a lot of this Exodus language. So as we go, we're kind of going through the story. So for example, Matthew chapter 1, we have the genealogy of Yeshua. And I point out that there are 42 generations tied to the 42 places in Numbers where they stopped, where the resting points through the wilderness. So we can kind of start there, and then we move into the herald, John the Baptist, prepare the way, and then Yeshua being immersed in water as Israel was immersed into the sea and comes up out of the other side. And then immediately Yeshua goes into the wilderness and does battle with the chaos figure Hasatan and defeats that figure, which is imagery of the defeat of Pharaoh and his army kind of thing. And then from there, we actually move into, well, he goes up to the Galilee, but we move into the Sermon on the Mount, which is just classic. I call it Torah 2.0. So this imagery pattern of Yeshua who goes up, and we don't know what mountain, so we're not going to, argue over that, but he ascends and sits with his disciples in the same way that Moses ascends the mountain into the presence of God and receives the tablets of stone to bring to the people. It serves as mediator between God and the people. And so Yeshua is doing a similar thing. Of course, he's taking the Torah to a whole new level, right? And he is making them, they got to look inward here on this. So the whole, Sermon on the Mount story is part of the Exodus story. And then, he calls the 12 in the same way we have the 12 tribes, and there's just so many things in it, obviously all leading up to Passover, because everything always, leads up to the Passover meal, which is, it's so interesting. There's a lot in that as well. So I mostly focused on Matthew, again, because of time and how much, space is going to take up in the book. But my favorite chapter really is dealing with these 7 mountains. And the other thing I deal with or talk a lot about is sort of the role of women as heralds in the scripture, and what an important role that is. So, for example, around Moses's birth, we have 7 women, which is quite interesting. We have the 2 the midwives. We've got Pharaoh's daughter. We have the maidservant of Pharaoh. We've got Yocheved, we got Miriam, and then we will have Zipporah at the well shortly thereafter. So we have these 7 women. So I showed in Matthew, Mark, was it Matthew? Yes, that we have 7 women there as well. And it lists 5 women in the genealogy. And then and shortly thereafter, we have Elizabeth and we have Miriam. And then a few verses later, we have Matthew addressing Rachel. So we have these 7 women, and I compare that to wisdom at the beginning, who builds herself a house of 7 pillars. And then I show how the women are the ones as heralds that show up at the resurrection of Yeshua. Although there's just all kinds of connections there to the Exodus story, but you don't really see it all until you get to the part about the Gospels, which is really starting in chapter 7. 7 through 11 is really dealing with the New Testament.
Apparently, I quit reading right where I would see it. That's good though. I will definitely read it, because that's one of the things I love. I love the little aha moments.
Well, there'll be a lot there in those chapters.
Whether I see them myself, which is rare, or whether or not they come from reading something like yourself, who's been a student and a scholar for 45 years, or my friend Halissa, or others who just bring out these nuggets, because y'all spent so much more time,
right? I mean, that's
studying the Torah and studying these patterns, and exactly. So they leap off the page to you after so many years. You go, wow, what's going on here? Why are the gospel writers choosing these words? Why are they why are they mentioning 7 women? What's going on here?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you got to ask those questions, because it's not accidental. This didn't just happen. So that there's all, you've got the cosmic mountain, that's a whole, topic in there. You've got the 7 women. And then there's a whole thing I do on the manna compared to the bread, the 5,000, feeding the 5,000, feeding the 4,000, how that ties to the manna, how that ties to the bread of the presence in the tabernacle and in the temple.
Expound on that. Explain that. I think people would enjoy that.
Okay, I don't want to give too much away.
Okay, well, just touch on it a little bit.
Yeah. So imagine, in the tabernacle, you had we call the table of showbread with the bread of the presence, the shulchan lechem hapanim, excuse me. And the bread of the presence was always, we think it was unleavened, and it represented the wisdom of God. And there were 12 loaves, obviously, to represent the 12 tribes. So what's interesting is, well, 5 of the loaves would be given to high priests to eat, and 7 of the loaves went to the priests themselves. And of course, it was every Shabbat when they traded out the new loaves for the old loaves. I can't imagine what they tasted like, but supposedly they tasted as though they were fresh. So you have these 12 loaves on the seventh day. And then in the story of the 5,000 and the 4,000, you have 12 loaves left over, right? And then you have the 7 loaves left over. And the story of the 5,000 in Matthew takes place on a mountain, which I talk about. And then you know that the 7 mountains, obviously there's a chiasm there because you have 7. And so the number 4 is going to be the center of the 7 mountains. So I was like, okay, what would be the center mountain of these 7 mountains? And it was the feeding of the 4,000. And so what's interesting about the feeding of the 4,000 is that's the feeding that was at the Decapolis when they were feeding the Gentiles. So the very center of the whole, process is the feeding of the Gentiles, and then they have 7 basketfuls left over. So there, I tried to put all that together to think about, what bread meant, and there's some scriptures in there, and I go into a little more detail. So this is sort of an overview, but so that all falls under when I get to the enthronement of Yeshua and then the meal, because the covenant meal is the ratification of the entire pattern and obviously of the enthronement. And so I talk about those feedings in that context.
And do you can't remember as far as like say the story of Elijah and do you bring that into the pattern like with Elijah being a prophet mainly to the northern kingdom?
No, I, didn't have time. And I really tried to stay true to what I wanted to say. I didn't want to go off script. You realize this book could have been like 1,000
Oh,
pages.
easily.
Yeah. And so, and so whenever I was sort of tempted, and I did kind of go down some rabbit holes, but when I was really tempted to go, I go, okay, what is your premise? What are you trying to do here? Stick to that. So the whole divine warrior pattern, the combat myth, the chaos, the procession, the proclamation, the temple, all of that. I try to just stay with that and not I really didn't, other than really just mentioning Elijah in passing on the Mount of Transfiguration, which
Right.
of course is a repeat of the Sinai experience. That one's fairly obvious. So, you'll probably find things, well, why didn't she talk about this? And why didn't she? But again, I wanted it to be readable. I didn't want it to be long. I wanted people to just, because I like to have my books just maybe around 200 to 220 pages max. I know once they're in the 300 realm, you feel like you're reading, this is going to take a while. So, I mean, I did the audio for the book, and it's probably about 6 hours, so it's not too bad.
Yeah. Well, let me think. What else? What other motifs? Obviously, we've got, and again, I did read the last chapter. We do see this divine warrior all over Revelation,
Yeah,
especially upon
all
Yeshua.
over. Yeah.
I mean, especially upon his return. I mean, you have the enemies being vanquished, chaos being defeated, order being established. His reign. What I believe is the seventh day, that Sabbath we talked about, and
Yeah.
how that all fits back into the creation story.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think you can understand, you just cannot look at Revelation in a vacuum. You simply have to it's all there. I mean, John, whoever wrote, recognized all these they knew the myths and the culture and these various themes and just concepts and brought them all out in this one book. But you can't start with that book because it doesn't
Well,
even make
so
any sense.
I I I have heard Orthodox rabbis say, "Oh, y'all stole that from us." In other words, whoever wrote Revelation, they understand that this person knew the prophets and knew the
For
Torah.
sure. Yeah.
I mean,
I call Revelation Exodus 2.0. Yeah.
and it really is.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a summation, and it is very chiastic in its nature too. I personally believe the center point would be like Revelation 12, where you almost have the whole redemption story,
Mhm. Yeah.
in that center theme, that you have the dragon, you've got
Right.
Revelation
There's the
12
chaos figure.
and
Yeah.
13, and you've got the woman, and she's being protected, and so
Yeah. Out in the wilderness. I mean, it's classic Exodus, you know.
meanwhile, the daughters that keep the testimony, that have the testimony and keep the commandments, the dragon is pursuing her and
Right.
tribulating her and
Yeah.
chasing her.
With
And so,
water and flood.
well,
Right.
yeah, I know that's not your shtick. You said prophecy, but I'd like to know your thoughts on that particular topic, and maybe why that imagery is used. The dragon spews water out, but the earth swallows up the water to protect the woman. Do you see any what connections are maybe you didn't even think about it in the book, but what connections would you make back to the Exodus or back to the Torah or the prophets?
Well, typically anything in the New Testament isn't going to be exactly the same as it
Right.
is in the story in the Hebrew scriptures. So, whenever you're looking for a reference back, it's not going to be identical. So then you ask yourself, okay, there's an addition here, or he didn't quote it exactly the same. How come the story isn't exactly the same? And so that's true with Revelation. I mean, yes, it's thematic of the Exodus, but it's not exact. Um, I would, in its context, for me, in the sort of the woman in the wilderness and the land swallowing up. I guess I see that more as the land of Israel has essentially been swallowed up by the Roman Empire.
Okay.
So for me, when I'm reading Revelation, I'm looking at it through the first century lens of what's going on geopolitically and historically in that. And so yes, the children of Israel are in exile, even though they're in their land because their land has been swallowed up, but they're in their land, but they're in exile. It's kind of a conundrum for them. They're probably, they're looking around going, wait, I'm in my land. This is my land, but it's been stripped from me, having gone through the sort of Hasmonean period and the Herodian period, and look at what we're in. So I don't see anything really heavy, deep in it per se. And there
Yeah.
could well be, but that's kind of from their view at that time and that perspective, that's how I would have seen it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking. I was thinking like the only time, and I agree with you that as prophecy is fulfilled, I believe it's a pattern and a repeat, but it's not going to necessarily be exactly the way it was.
Right.
In other words, it's going to be similar. The pattern's going to hold true, but the only time I can think of land swallowing anything up, the earth swallowing anything, was Korah and the
Sure.
rebellion.
Yeah.
And then the rebellion against Moses, who was at that point in time the mediator, and Yeshua is now the mediator. And so maybe there's some type of rebellion amongst,
Well, you
we know
can, yeah, there's always rebellion. So yeah, we can pretty well.
but the water, our discussion and reading your book, just the water representing chaos.
Yeah.
And so the dragon is spewing this chaos, not
Yeah.
necessarily literal water coming out of a dragon. There's
Right.
not a water breathing dragon, in other
Right.
words. I'm
Yeah.
not I'm not taking that literally.
No, that's exact. I mean, and I know it's hard for people because we really have a very weak understanding of the ancient culture and what these symbols meant to them. And I always encourage people at least understand the basics, understand how the ancients viewed water, how they viewed mountains, how they viewed gardens, how they saw their kings. If you at least have the basics, you don't have to go in there and take everything literally, because you're probably going to be in error if you do. That's not the way they meant to convey it. So one of the things I might mention, I told you the sort of structure of all this was something called the combat myth.
Mhm.
And so that's early on, if you go back to the early ancient Mesopotamian period and into the Babylonian, the combat myth was something quite common. And as things evolve, and when we get to the New Testament, I suggest that the combat myth is kind of morphed into apocalyptic literature, because you see similar kind of language. And so, I mean, it's not surprising that over time these things take on, sort of a different look, a different meaning, perhaps. And so I see the whole apocalyptic literature genre as being the evolution of the combat myth. And the same things still apply of the divine warrior defeating chaos, of a victory, of the temple, of enthronement, of procession, proclamation. All those same images come to bear, whether you're reading the book of Daniel or, Ezekiel or whatever.
Yeah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah would be, at least if I'm off the top of my head, the most apocalyptic as far as visions and imagery.
Yeah, and all that is in there. All that is in those books. So I find that to be very interesting. So, of course, when we get to Revelation, it's sort of the, pièce de résistance, if you will, of combat myth, as it has evolved into apocalyptic literature.
And it's drawing all over from the Torah and the prophets.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's, to the testimony, those who have the testimony of Yeshua and keep the commandments. I mean, he didn't cite Isaiah 8, but he might as well have. Once you understand
I could have done a whole nother book just on the prophets and the Exodus. I had to just figure out a way. Let's just keep it simple and focused. But the prophets are filled with Exodus language, repeating it as they go through the Assyrian and Babylonian, periods of exile. It's just everywhere.
Well, and you see, like in Isaiah, you see it especially you see it everywhere. I mean, Isaiah 11, is talking about more of and I will gather the house of Israel and the house of Judah from the nations. We won't be fighting anymore. We won't be envious. We won't be jealous. We won't, you won't have this tension between these, Judaism and Christianity. We'll be one in Messiah. I like to say, the 2 8s, the 2 sticks.
Yeah.
Truly will become one. I mean, we're supposed to be one now. And I'm praying that, that's the best we can do right now is pray and hope. And we should be, but sadly we just have.
I think if we recognize our purpose, if we have the same purpose and mission, then we can be one, because we're working together to bring about the same result. If we all have different purposes and different missions, then we go different ways, and we think ours is more important than somebody else's. And I think that's really sort of at the root of Israel herself. Is her purpose was to bring the nations, all of humanity, to God. Mm-hmm. And that's really the whole purpose of the Bible. That was God chose her to show the way to the nations, to the Gentiles, to humanity, of how you can approach a holy God. They had the protocol. They had all of the elements. And I think we have sort of forgotten that's our mission.
Well, we see that early on, like in Acts, we see that as these former pagans are hearing in the gospel and placing their faith in Yeshua, there's this meeting, and they're like, okay, we're going to start them out with baby steps. Okay. Yeah. For us to be able to fellowship with them. Okay. No more blood drinking, everybody. You can't be worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by going to pagan temples. Speaking of temple, there's a proper way to worship God and a proper way not to.
Yeah.
And you guys will learn the rest of it on Sunday when Paul's letters are read in Sunday school. So and I'm being very facetious when I say that.
Well, we're all of one faith, and I'm not in the division business, and my goal is to present, both sides, Christians and Messianic Jews and whatever Jews are willing to listen, the story, the big picture, and to help people recognize their role and function in all this, and to not sort of dig down into their little fiefdoms and their agendas, because this is the big story about the redemption of all of humanity, and Israel was the mechanism.
Yeah, and just we've got, we'll shut it off after about an hour, but along that line, I think that's very important. One that
Yeah.
you shared, and we talked briefly about your post about Charlie Kirk
Hmm.
and the seeds and how we never know how many seeds Charlie planted.
That's right.
In other words, he was a sower.
He
He
was
wasn't necessarily a harvester. He probably didn't have time to truly disciple anybody. He was out
right.
there just he was
Well, that
sowing
man did a
seed.
lot of sewing.
Yeah, I mean, he was sowing seed, and he was also trying to do some. He was trying to do some heavy weeding, especially amongst the younger crowd. And I just see people in the Torah movement that would say that, oh, because Charlie had only recently. I mean, and I was encouraged. I had actually prayed, Dina. I had prayed that there might be a famous Christian pastor that would see the beauty of the Sabbath, see why it's a blessing to keep the Sabbath, why it's a blessing to keep his feast. How honoring and obeying God is it shows A, we love him, but B, it's for our good. It's not
Right.
it's not some burden for us to carry. So I've
Right.
been praying about that. And then sadly, here we have someone probably more famous that at least from what I can tell exhibited fruit in his life, who had started to honor the Shabbat, and I'm seeing that those videos of him talking about the beauty of the Sabbath.
Yeah.
He gets assassinated, and he's got a book about the beauty of Shabbat coming
Right.
out in
Stop
December.
in the name of God, it's called.
And and so again, I'm sitting there going, that's just like God to
Yeah.
use.
Why use a pastor when you could use someone, this young man, 31 years old, he clearly had given his life, he dedicated his life to God in such a way that God was able to use him. And
Yeah,
he equipped himself and learned and studied. We talked about the autodidact. I mean, he was a self-learner. He dropped out of college and he went to the very people that where the heart of God lies, the young people who are just traumatized by life these days, who are feeling abandoned, rejected, that they'll never make it, they'll never get married, they'll never have enough money, they'll never be able to buy a home. Like life just looks hopeless to them. And so he dedicated himself to that generation. And kudos to him. I mean, to me, I don't know how to reach that generation. I'm like way past that. So our only hope, if we're looking at it in a, sort of a, how do I want to say this? Uh, we really need for this generation to rise up, to be challenged, to be, transformed, because my generation, we're dying off here pretty quickly, and he was willing to pour himself out for those young people, and to me, I was just so blessed and honored to see that, and it bore fruit. And I don't know the rhyme or reason for any of it, but I am just stunned by the response. I mean, people talking about going to church, haven't been in church ever, or been 10 years. Just the stories of how he touched lives, and you're going, holy cow. Like,
well, and
when he
again,
died.
you know, get them to apply the blood back to the Exodus theme. Israel, they had simple faith. They were given a simple message about Passover and about the blood and about being saved from that last plague. And I
Yeah.
believe that's where you see.
Uh-huh.
Yes. It doesn't require perfection. I believe the more the more you understand, the more is expected of you as far as
Yes.
holiness.
Yeah. More
You,
responsibility with the more
yeah,
you
yeah, I
know.
like, come as you are, but don't stay that way.
Yeah.
Yeshua loves you just as you are when you come to faith in him, but he doesn't want you to stay that way.
Agreed.
There's a lot of cleaning going on. There's garment preparation.
Yep.
So,
It's a lifetime cleaning process.
oh yeah,
Yep.
I need to get in the washing machine daily.
Yeah.
So just like taking a bath because you start to stink.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate anything else you want to end with about the book or anything.
No, and of course, we're just finishing up here. I'm sort of anxious to get the book out, but it will be on Amazon, and it's called The Greatest Exodus, a Divine Warrior Tradition. I'm hoping within about 2 weeks it'll be up there. I will, of course, post it the second it's live on Amazon. It'll be on my Facebook. So, if anyone listening isn't on my Facebook page, you might want to jump on there, because I do post 3 or 4 times a week. Tried post meaningful messages from the Bible and relevant for today. And so then I'll let you know when the book is live. So it'll be available in paperback, Audible, and Kindle.
And I enjoy reading Dina's Facebook post. And
Oh,
this.
thank you, Scott.
No, I do. I don't butter muffins. So.
Yes. Well, it's fun. Some of them are hit and miss, but I'm gonna keep on keeping on. I will have a new website. It's not up yet either. Everything's coming together at once, but it'll just be dinadye.com. It's not live yet. So, but yeah, so all of that, it'll link to all the books and to my membership Foundations and Torah page as well. So it'll all be there, and plus new blogs and lots of stuff.
Well, I appreciate you joining me, and I hope your book is a blessing to all who read it. And I will be reading middle chapters now.
Get on it.
All right.
Thanks,
all right, I'm going to end the stream. Thank you, Miss Di.
Okay.
We don't want to play with that.